Now, what was the ISIS leader talking about when he said this? And he declared in 2014 that ISIS wouldn't stop till they put the last nail in the coffin of the Sykes-Picot conspiracy. Although the existence of the Sykes-Picot Agreement was not the primary cause of the rise of ISIS, there can be little doubt that it did help to feed the fire of that movement. And as an illustration, here is a brief extract, if I can get it going, of an ISIS video.
As you can see right now, we're in the border of Iraq and Sham.
دولة الإسلام قامت بدماء الصادقين أمتي قد لاح فجر فارق بالنصر المبين دولة الإسلام قامت بدماء الصادقين.
Right now I'm in the side of Sham. As you can see, this is the so-called border of Sykes-Picot. Alhamdulillah, we don't recognize it and we will never recognize it. Inshallah, this is not the first border we will break. Inshallah, we will break other borders also, but we start with this, inshallah. So inshallah, if we walk, inshallah, we cross the border. And we'll see that, alhamdulillah, there used to be the Safawi army used to stand here. They used to stand here. This is the so-called border with the police and the people used to pass. Alhamdulillah, there's nobody now except the soldiers of Dawlat al-Islam. So alhamdulillah, inshallah, we cross the border. Bismillah. This is the so-called checkpoint where the soldiers of Malik used to stand. Alhamdulillah. And as you can see here, it's a sign. It says Commandos Battalion Border. The only commandos and battalion here is the Battalion of Islam, inshallah ta'ala.
When one looks at the map of the Middle East, one is struck by the straight lines that delineate the internationally recognized borders between Syria, Iraq, and Jordan and Saudi Arabia. And they are, of course, not the only countries that have straight lines for boundaries. Much of the western half of the United States and Canada is mostly a straight line. But at least there isn't a group in Canada stating that it doesn't recognize the border and seeks to establish an Islamic caliphate in Canada, Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, and Minnesota. So why and when did these borders in the Middle East come about? Well, yes, again, it was largely the British and the French. And like everything else in the Middle East, it is a very convoluted tale. What began as a fairly simple division of the spoils of war became inextricably entangled with misunderstandings, broken promises, friction between Arab tribes, and unfolding events. And Prime Minister Harold Macmillan of England was once asked by a young reporter, what did he fear most in his political life? And he said, events, dear boy, events. Unforeseen events such as the Balfour Declaration and the creation of a national home for the Jews, the Russian Revolution of 1917, the success of Kemal Atatürk in recovering Turkey in the Turkish War of Independence in 1921-22, the rise of Ibn Saud in 1924-25, and differing agendas and priorities all complicated the situation. The tale has whiffs of skullduggery, dirty work at the crossroads, and some noteworthy personalities. And it was a stepping stone in what many in the region continue to this day to regard as a long series of betrayals, false promises, and interference by Western powers from the dismantlement of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, the establishment of Israel in 1948, the overthrow of Prime Minister Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, the military intervention by the British and the French in the Suez Canal crisis in 1956, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and the continuing failure to achieve statehood for Palestine. In Europe, World War I began in August 1914. Great Britain, France, and Tsarist Russia were lined up against Germany, Austria-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire had already been crumbling for over a century. And by 1914, it was reduced to what you can see here, what is now Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, much of Iraq, and then those two extended strips southwards along the Red Sea to the head of the Persian Gulf. Britain and France already had major interests in the Eastern Mediterranean, and a defeat of Turkey offered attractive prospects of further expansion. As early as November 1915, London and Paris began secret negotiations on how to slice and dice the Middle East once the war was over. Led by Sir Mark Sykes on your left of Great Britain and François-Georges Picot of France, the outcome of the negotiations was set out in a letter from the British Foreign Secretary to the French ambassador in London on the 16th of May, 1916, almost exactly 100 years ago. Sir Mark Sykes, although you see them both in uniform here, it was because of the World War I. Sir Mark Sykes was a traveler in the Middle East. He was military, but he worked for the diplomatic service. François-Georges Picot was a French lawyer, a rather hard-nosed, tough negotiator. The agreement didn't delineate the borders as such, but established spheres of influence and areas of direct control. Area A in blue, as you can see there, covering modern-day Syria, Lebanon, northern Iraq, Mosul, and southeastern Turkey, including Kurdistan, would go to France. Area B, known today as Jordan, south and central Iraq, and the port of Haifa in Israel, would go to the British. And the sections in darker blue and darker red would respectively be under direct French and British control. The yellow area, down the bottom left-hand side, of Palestine, excluding the ports of Haifa and Acre, would be subject to some form of international administration, which was left to be decided at a later date. Russia was also involved. By another earlier secret agreement between Britain and Russia in March 1915, Russia would have the Anatolian vilayets, that is the provinces in eastern Turkey. They would annex the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, which was later renamed Istanbul, and they would have control of the Dardanelles, thus securing Russian access from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, in return for which Russia would accept British claims on other parts of the Ottoman Empire, including the oil-rich region of Mesopotamia. Now, contributing factors to all this were the fact that Britain, having converted its large naval fleet from coal to oil, was particularly interested in securing reliable access to oil supply from the sources that were known at that time, which is basically down in the Basra area at the top of the Persian Gulf. And in addition, a constant British aim in even these days is to keep Russia from getting a warm water port, keep Russian influence out of the Persian Gulf. So such was the plan in 1916. And to the traditional imperialist minds in London and Paris, it all made very good political and economic common sense. After all, to the winners of war go the spoils. And at first sight, Sykes-Picot was an excellent example of diplomatic cooperation conducted at the level of the two capitals of two major allies during a violent war. However, the British and French certainly had their own particular interests at heart. They paid little attention to the interests of the Arabs, and let alone the interests of the Turks, who of course were losing their empire entirely. But nice, tidy plans are so often upset by the maneuvering of different factions in capitals, and by what happens in the field when those charged with doing the actual fighting or dealing with local leaders have different ideas and promote other arrangements from the people at headquarters. At about the same time, in 1915-16, as Sykes-Picot were in communication and drawing lines on the map, Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, was exchanging letters with this gentleman, the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein ibn Ali al-Hashimi. The Hashemite family traced their descent from the Prophet Muhammad and were governors or sharifs of Mecca for hundreds of years. Seeing the end of the Ottoman Empire in sight, Arab nationalists wanted independence. And in exchange for Arab help in fighting the Turks, in his letters, Sir Henry McMahon agreed to recognize Arab independence after World War I, quote, in the limits and boundaries proposed by the Sharif of Mecca. So it was within the limits and boundaries proposed by the Arabs, and McMahon agreed to that. But he did stipulate that it should exclude areas in which France had interests, whatever they may be. Now, as it turned out, from the outset, this commitment contradicted the emerging Sykes-Picot Agreement, which, of course, Sir Henry McMahon knew nothing about because it was secret. And later, it was further contradicted by the 1917 Balfour Declaration, by which Britain agreed to the establishment of a homeland for Jews. And thus were planted some of the seeds of confusion and the complex situation in the Middle East that continue to bedevil us today. History has shown that there are times when just the right man or woman turns up in the right place at the right time. Highly active in the field against the Turks was a young British officer, Thomas Edward Lawrence, who became known as Lawrence of Arabia. You perhaps recall the movie in 1962 with Peter O'Toole playing the part of Lawrence. Peter O'Toole was 6'3". Lawrence was only 5'5". Yet he turned out to be a bundle of energy, imagination, military daring, and leadership. And when war broke out in 1914, Lawrence was a 26-year-old postgraduate archaeologist who had traveled widely in the Ottoman provinces, and he was competent in ancient Greek, Arabic, and French. As such, he was prime material for intelligence work, and he was quickly enlisted in the army and sent to work with the British intelligence cell situated in Cairo. And it was there that in 1915, Lawrence came into contact with Gertrude Bell. Now, at the age of 47, Gertrude Bell was 20 years older than Lawrence. And she was a very noteworthy, remarkable woman. She had graduated with honors from Oxford University in 1892, and then become an academic, an archaeologist, an explorer, and a writer with a love for languages. She had climbed mountains in the Alps in Europe, traveled extensively in Persia and in Ottoman provinces of Mesopotamia and Arabia. And along the way, she'd become fluent in Arabic, Persian, French, German, and she could also converse in Italian and Turkish. Wow. Huh? She had explored and charted a great swath of Arabia, from remote Greater Syria to the waters of the Persian Gulf. And as a single woman in a traditionally male-dominated society, she had gained the respect and admiration of the Arabs for her personality and for her fortitude and understanding of Arab culture. Her upright bearing, and calm sense of authority led many Arabs to the opinion that a queen had come amongst them. And although she rode side saddle when in Western company, on her travels in the desert, she wore a divided skirt that allowed her to ride like a man. She would spend up to 12 hours a day in the burning heat and drink water from stagnant pools. And yet, her traveling caravan included a tin bath, a full Wedgwood dinner service, and a formal dinner dress for evening wear when needed. She also had much political acuity. Where others saw only squabbles between nomadic tribes, she recognized the ambitions of the two great rival Arab clans, the Wahhabis of Ibn Saud and the Hashemites of Hussein. and she stored away that knowledge for future reference. Now, sent from Egypt to Arabia, Lawrence worked with the Arab irregular troops in guerrilla operations against the Turks. Quickly gaining the confidence of Arab leaders, he encouraged them to avoid frontal attacks, and instead they should concentrate on surprise raids, sabotage of rail links, and destruction of logistics. And in this way, the Ottoman authorities had to tie up considerable assets in protection, considerable resources in protection of assets, as they never knew where the next raid would take place. Lawrence led many daring expeditions behind the Turkish lines, earning the respect and the admiration of the Arabs with whom he worked. And it's often been said that one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, and certainly to the Turks, Lawrence and his guerrillas were regarded as terrorists. The Arab Revolt itself began in June 1916, when an Arab army of around 30,000 men moved against the Ottoman forces. Now, to assemble this army, Hussein had made deals with various families, clans, and tribes, and many of these irregulars would only fight close to home, and all, of course, had to be paid. And just as today we see among the rebel groups in Syria, some tribes wouldn't fight alongside others because of feuds. Most were capricious warriors, battling furiously when the looting was good and the enemy was weak, but then drifting back to their villages when they became bored or there was nothing to be gained. Without the provision of weapons and other military supplies from the British, they would not have been successful against the Ottoman army. But of course, they knew the land very well. And under the leadership of Hussein's sons, they participated in the capture of Aqaba and the severing of that vital strategic link through the Arab Peninsula, which ran from Damascus in the north all the way down to Medina in what is today's Saudi Arabia. This enabled a British expeditionary force under the command of General Allenby to advance into the Ottoman territories of Palestine and Syria, culminating in the capitulation of Turkey on the 31st of October 1918. And you will recall November 1918 was the month of the Great Armistice that brought the war to an end. General Allenby allowed the Arab forces to proclaim an Arab state with its capital in Damascus, even though, according to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, Damascus was clearly in the area to be placed under French influence. The confusion began to gather. By his initiative and leadership of Arab guerrillas, Lawrence himself came to be highly regarded by Emir Faisal Hussein of the Hashemite tribe, and he was the elder son of the Sharif of Mecca. And in return, Lawrence strongly urged his superiors in Egypt and in London to approve a policy of post-war Arab independence. But, as so often happens, views from those in the field did not agree with the wider picture as perceived by those at headquarters in London and Paris. In the corridors of power of imperialist London, the concept of independence was not something that was widely accepted. And so there was only thin support for Damascus to be the capital of an independent Arab state, with King Faisal as its monarch. And of course, Paris had yet other ideas. Being in the zone that Sykes-Picot had allocated to being under French influence, the French saw Syria as just being another Tunisia or Algeria, and they wanted it firmly under a French-appointed administration. And then to add to that, of course, the French were always suspicious of what the British were up to, and they had concerns that perhaps the British were trying to grab too much. The armistice of World War I in November 18 was followed by the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Diplomats from over 32 countries and nationalities took part. But in practice, the deals were made by the Big Four: Prime Ministers of Britain, France, Italy, and President Woodrow Wilson of the United States. And Wilson, with his famous or infamous 14 points, and American enthusiasm for the principle of self-determination, had no wish to encourage further colonial expansion. But then he found himself up against the traditionalists of Britain, France, and Italy, who were determined, after their major sacrifices on the battlefront, and by that I mean the British had lost 750,000 soldiers dead or missing. The French had lost 1.1 million. Even Italy had lost 500,000. These were sacrifices not to be put on one side. So Britain, France, and Italy were determined to divide the overseas territories of the losers among themselves. Prime Minister Clemenceau of France is reputed to have complained, "Mr. Wilson bores me with these 14 points. Why, God Almighty only had 10. For the former Ottoman lands, Wilson proposed an international commission to ascertain the wishes of local inhabitants. The gentleman in the front there is Prince Faisal. You can see over his left shoulder is Lawrence of Arabia advising him at the time. Wilson proposed an international commission to ascertain the wishes of local inhabitants. But with the Sykes-Picot Agreement in their pockets, the British and French were having none of that. Consult the local inhabitants? Goodness me, how naive could you get? And in the end, it became a solely American commission, led by Henry King, president of Oberlin College, and millionaire businessman Richard Crane, which visited the Middle East in the summer of 1919, taking statements and sampling local opinions. They visited 36 cities and towns in 42 days. And at the end, the commission concluded that the people of the Middle East fervently did want independence. They did not want the British and the French to replace the hated Turks as their new masters. And the Arabs were also bitterly against the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. And so the commission counseled that the Zionist project should be given up, as it could only be carried out by an endless force of arms against the non-Jewish residents of Palestine. On August the 31st, Crane cabled President Wilson, quote, "Report well-founded on vital human facts, not in harmony with many things the Alliance doing or planning to do," unquote. The King-Crane Commission came to the conclusion that while the Middle East was not ready for independence, a colonial government wouldn't serve the people well either. And so it recommended instead that the Americans should move in to occupy the region. Yeah, because only the United States could be trusted to guide the people to self-sufficiency and independence rather than simply become an imperialist occupier. Now, of course, by the time these recommendations were made, the Republicans had regained control of the United States Senate, and in the fall of 1919, the Senate rejected President Wilson's support of the establishment of the League of Nations and all his other ideas. The predominant sentiment in Washington at the time was one of isolation. And so there was absolutely no chance of the King-Crane Commission's recommendations being accepted. And of course, this suited the British and the French perfectly well. And thus, the King-Crane Commission was laid to rest in State Department archives and is scarcely ever remembered. And I doubt if there's anybody in this room today who's ever heard of the King-Crane Commission before. Meanwhile, in June 1919, nationalists in Syria had gathered together in Damascus to form a new Syrian Congress. And in March 1920, they declared the independence of the Arab Kingdom of Syria. And you can see how far that would have been. It was going to be under King Faisal with French advisors. But with Sykes-Picot in French minds, and the British doing nothing more than mumbling in their teacups, Arab independence was not acceptable to the French. In early July, King Faisal was called upon to surrender. And when Arab nationalists clashed with French troops in late July, the Arab nationalists were soundly defeated. French troops marched into Damascus, and the French mandate over Syria and Lebanon began. Faisal himself was forced to flee to London and go into exile. And the Arabs became widely resentful of the promises that had been broken, particularly as they saw it by the British and by the overbearing attitude of the French. Now, amongst the British themselves, there were mixed feelings. In London, the Sykes-Picot Agreement had been a formal agreement between two sovereign states, and the maintenance of good, well, workable Anglo-French relations was far more important than relations with a bunch of disorganized and squabbling Arabs. And by 1920, there was also the existence of the undertakings given in the Balfour Declaration to provide a homeland for Jews in Palestine. On the other side, Sir Henry McMahon, who of course had not been aware of the Sykes-Picot Agreement when he wrote his letters to the Sheriff of Mecca, he'd already resigned, because what had happened is that after the Russian Revolution in 1917, the Bolsheviks had inherited the Tsar's archives, and they had found in the archives the secret agreement. And the Bolshevik agreement, perhaps as a sign of their dislike of the British and French support, which was given to the resistance by the White Russians, they had actually publicized the secret agreement and let it be known that this agreement had existed. King Faisal had not been told about the secret agreement either. So McMahon was now further embarrassed by the lack of clarity in his 1915 letter to Prince Faisal and the differing interpretations given to it, which had added to the Arab view that they had been betrayed. Lawrence, in the meantime, had resigned from the army in disgust at the failure of the Paris Peace Conference to give the independence to the Arabs that he believed had been promised. But in 1920, this still left the matter of the British area's influence in Mesopotamia under Sykes-Picot to be resolved. And by this time, the area around Mosul, originally expected to be in the area under French influence, had actually been given to the British. It is reputed that when Prime Minister Clemenceau of France, who was brought up in the time of oil lamps, was told by his advisors that the area around Mosul was valuable because it had oil deposits, he said, "Oil? If I want oil, I'll go to the grocers." Clemenceau was far more interested in French control of the coast and the western areas bordering the Mediterranean Sea than having responsibility for the French presence in the far distant hinterland. And then events in Turkey also took their toll. There was the Turkish War of Independence, led by Kemal Atatürk from 1919 to 1923. No longer would the French and Russians have control of Anatolia in eastern Turkey. And separately, of course, no longer was Russia able to annex Constantinople and have easy access to the Mediterranean. Now, this turn of events happened to suit London and Paris quite well. As with the Russian Revolution and the assassination of the Tsar and his family by the Bolsheviks, the British and the French were no longer enthused by the idea of the Russian Navy having easy access to the Mediterranean. Russian interest in the Mediterranean has continued to this day, and indeed may be reflected in the activity that Russia has shown in building up the small naval facility that it has had for many years in the Syrian Mediterranean port of Tartus. That's number 3 on your map. Russia has had a small naval presence, I won't say a naval base, but a naval presence there under the Assad government for many years. And with Russia's involvement in Latakia and supporting the Assad regime, Russia has taken time to increase its presence in Tartus. In 1921, London was faced with how best to assert control of the British share of Sykes-Picot and what to do with the spare king that they had now in exile in London. And so another conference was called the Cairo Conference. And here you see a picture of it. You see the red dot. Here's Churchill, who at the time was the colonial secretary. Here is Lawrence of Arabia. And amongst all these men, The only woman is Gertrude Bell. Among other sources of advice, once again, they turned to Gertrude Bell. Her long and extensive knowledge of the three Ottoman provinces of Basra, Baghdad, and now Mosul was invaluable. And in the wake of broken promises regarding Syria, she was keen to see an Arab government settled in what was to be called Iraq. This suited London, as they saw the area from Baghdad down the coast of the Persian Gulf to be under British control rather than just under British influence. And the outcome was that Iraq was established as a monarchy, and in 1921, the British placed King Faisal on the throne as King Faisal of Iraq. Having been unable to give him the Arab kingdom of Syria, then they gave him Iraq. For several years, Gertrude Bell was an integral part of the new administration, advising King Faisal on local issues, supervising the selection of appointees in his new cabinet, and other leadership posts. But at the same time, she saw the truth of a Baghdad newspaper's observation that London had promised an Arab government with British advisors, but in practice had imposed a British government under a nominal monarch with Arab advisors. Her immediate superior, Sir Arthur Wilson, the British commissioner in Baghdad, believed in strict British imperial control. And moreover, remember at the time there was the British Raj in India, and the colonial leadership of the British Raj in India tended to think of Delhi as the capital through which relations with the Gulf states should be maintained. And the British Raj in India was staunchly opposed to any sentimental talk of Arab independence. As well as placing Faisal on the throne in Iraq, the British placed his brother Abdullah on the throne of the new country of Transjordan. And the present King Abdullah II in Jordan is his grandson. But while the Hashemite family was well known in Western Arabia, this was not the case in Baghdad and Iraq. Faisal, after all, was not Iraqi. He was largely foreign to the people of Iraq, and he was perceived as an agent of British imperialism. Moreover, he was a Sunni Muslim, while the majority of the population of central and southern Iraq were Shia Muslims, as they are today, and the Kurds in the north were more interested in autonomy than being ruled from Baghdad, as they are today. Once again, there were serious differences of perception between those at headquarters in London and those out in the field. And even the imperialist Wilson himself found himself sympathizing with Bell. The very existence of a Shia majority in Iraq was blandly denied as a figment of my imagination by one expert with an international reputation. And Miss Bell and I found it impossible to convince either the military or the Foreign Office delegation that Kurds in the Mosul vilayet were numerous and likely to be troublesome, or that Ibn Saud was a power seriously to be reckoned with. The Hashemite family ruled Iraq until King Faisal's grandson and his immediate family were all murdered in a bloody coup on July the 14th, 1958. The actual delineation of national borders, largely on Sykes-Picot lines of what are now Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, was only hammered out in a series of conferences and treaties in the early 1920s. The rise to power of Kemal Ataturk and the Turkish War of Independence led to the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. Adjustments to the border of Turkey, so that Turkey then extended all the way east, and no longer, as I said before, gave the Anatolia provinces to France. And it left the Middle East largely as we see it today. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia arose outside Sykes-Picot. The family of Ibn Saud were the traditional leaders of the Wahhabi movement in Islam, and they were long-standing opponents of the Sharif Hussein of Mecca. In 1924-25, Ibn Saud defeated Hussein and declared himself king of Hejaz and Najd. And after consolidating his power over most of the Arabian Peninsula, in 1932, he proclaimed himself king of Saudi Arabia. And the Saudi family remains the monarchy of Saudi Arabia to this day. As king of Saudi Arabia, he granted oil concessions to the Standard Oil Company, and with the discovery of large oil deposits in 1938, Saudi Arabia began its climb to riches from the development of oil. And it's interesting to contemplate what might have been the outcome if rich oil deposits had been found, say, in Jordan instead of Saudi Arabia. After resigning from the army as a colonel, Lawrence withdrew into civilian life. He served as an advisor to Winston Churchill for much of 1921, and then in 1922 he changed his name to Ross, and he enlisted in the Royal Air Force as a basic aircraftsman. At the same time, he was writing his famous account of his operations in Arabia, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, and that was later published a year or two afterwards in 1926. But meantime, when his true identity was found out by the media in 1925, he was forced out of the Air Force. He changed his name yet again to Shaw. And in 1925, he was allowed to rejoin the Air Force until 1935. And in May 1935, he was killed in a motorcycle accident when he was only 46 years old. As for Gertrude Bell, she never married or had children. The love of her life had been killed at the Battle of Gallipoli in 1915. She was highly regarded in Iraq, but at home the opinion of Sir Mark Sykes was this, which is rather different. As he complained fairly comprehensively in a letter to his wife, "Confound the silly, chattering windbag of conceited, gushing, flat-chested man-woman, globe-trotting, rump-wagging, blethering ass." Pretty strong stuff, huh? Bell remained in Baghdad after Faisal's 1921 ascension to the throne as the new king in Iraq, working to fund and construct an archaeological museum. She pioneered the idea of keeping antiquities in the country of origin rather than transporting them to European centers of learning. And the result of Gertrude Bell's efforts was the National Museum of Iraq, which holds today one of the world's greatest collections of Mesopotamian antiquities. On 12th of July, 1926, while she was still living in Baghdad, she took an overdose of sleeping pills and died. And her death has generally been taken as suicide, as she did by that time have health problems and was depressed at the recent death of her brother. And she is buried today in a British cemetery in Baghdad. So where does all this convoluted tale leave us? Let us start by looking at the bright side. Perhaps we should all feel grateful that the recommendations of the King Crane Commission were never implemented. If they had, and if the United States had moved in to occupy the region, America might well have been loaded with the heavy culpability that history has now left on the shoulders of the British and the French. On the other hand, perhaps America might have been much more successful in satisfying the fractious Arabs. Although with the continuing and solid support that the United States has given to Israel in the past half-century, I rather doubt it. So the legacy of Sykes-Picot itself has several elements. First, the lines on the map of today go right back to Sykes-Picot. In the end, they were drawn with comparatively little respect for Arab tribal interests, and more often to correspond to the wishes for control and influence by the British and the French. Secondly, the unfolding of events and political decisions left a widespread and abiding feeling of resentment among many Arabs at being betrayed, and that feeling continues to this day. Promises of Arab national independence were broken. Governments were put in place that would serve the interests of European outsiders. And over the years, those governments have often led, usually by coup d'etat, to local leaders who have sought to accumulate and preserve their own power rather than serve the interests of the people. As we have seen in Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Assad in Syria, and indeed the Saudi royal family in Saudi Arabia. Thirdly, the word crusade. The word crusade has a deep effect on Arabs. Those Europeans from Britain and France who gave the Arabs the Sykes-Picot Agreement were from the same countries as the Crusaders who had sought to impose their will over Muslims some 9 centuries earlier. And in fundamentalist Muslim circles, those memories still rankle. You will recall that even in September 2001, President Bush's reference to a crusade against terrorism immediately rang alarm bells in Europe and the Middle East, and brought back memories to the Muslim world of how Christian knights had launched many attacks against Jerusalem in the 1100s and 1200s. They have long memories. Fourthly, although not a part of Sykes-Picot, but conducted at the same time frame, and an additional cause of Arab resentment, to many Arabs, who the heck were the British to give away Palestine to the Jews by the Balfour Declaration? Fifthly, the legacy of Sykes-Picot and what has happened in the Middle East in more recent years illustrate yet again the dangers of unforeseen events and unintended consequences. As I've said before, at the time that Sykes-Picot was agreed in 1916, it all seemed very sensible and pragmatic to the British and French. But very quickly, differing interpretations were put on words, different priorities and agendas came to the fore, new and unexpected elements such as the Balfour Declaration, the Russian Revolution, and the Turkish War of Independence intruded, and they all conspired to upset the perceived balance. And sixthly, and last, here is another extract from the ISIS video called The End of Sykes-Picot, in which ISIS blows up an Iraqi border post between Iraq and Syria.
These brothers, they are responsible for the explosive. Allah accept from them and raise their ranks, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair.
بثبات ويقين دولة الإسلام قامت بجهاد المتقين.
This is the police station, inshallah. The Ikhwa, they're going to explore it now, inshallah. Ya Allah.
If you want to look at the whole of that ISIS video, there is the YouTube website. So there's one final thought. With all this confusion and chaos, these things have long roots. And what was originally intended to be a good thing and was seen to be very sensible in London and Paris has come to haunt us even to today. And in many ways, we've continued to not make it better, but probably make it worse. So there's much truth into the old adage. Those who fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it. Thank you very much.